Howdy, everyone. Thank you for your attention. I'm very glad to be here, very excited to be representing the algae community here at New Harvest. So today I want to tell you why I think algae is cellular agriculture's green machine. As I was introduced, I work at a food and nutrition company called Qualitas Health. We recently launched a national brand called Iwi that you'll hear a little bit more about later, and why it is important for algae as cellular agriculture. I've been farming algae, again, for about 10 years, and really love it. It's my passion in life, and I'm very excited to be here talking to you about farming algae in particular. So before I was farming algae, I've been in and around agriculture for a very long time. My family has farmed many different crops in Texas for several generations. So I come from a farming background, but decided when I went through school and then went to college that I was going to be a scientist. So I got my PhD and did lots of cool and interesting things with viruses, and eventually ended up right back into farming. So although I've branched out a little bit from the family business, I'm very excited to also be right back there. Algae really captured my attention during my postdoc for a number of reasons. It is the ancestor of plants. It's who we have to thank for all of our modern agriculture and the plants that we eat and use for materials today. And in fact, we've been eating algae directly or indirectly for thousands of years. So it's been very important in human development as well as development of life overall. And perhaps most famously, in recent memory, algae's been used as a feedstock for biofuels. And that's where I got my start in farming algae. I worked at a company called Sapphire Energy and helped to grow that business from lab all the way to commercial scale and ran their commercial biomass production for a number of years. The reason that I really love algae, aside from the fact that it's cool and it does all those things, is because it's a really small package that does really big things, right? So when we talk about algae, we're usually talking about microalgae, which are single-celled organisms. And although they don't make up very much biomass in terms of percent of photosynthetic biomass on the earth, they do the heavy lifting when it comes to photosynthetic capabilities on the earth. So less than 5% of the biomass on Earth does about 55% of the photosynthesis. And what this means, and is particularly important for algae as agriculture, is that they have incredibly high potential for biomass production. They require relatively low inputs, and this makes them a very desirable crop for sustainable farming. The other cool thing about algae is they're very highly diverse. Last count for microalgae, the estimate was over 70,000 species. Less than half of those have been named, and far less than half of that have even been characterized at all. So there's, in addition to the strict biomass potential that algae represents, there's a huge diversity in terms of what we can grow for that biomass. And for as many species there are also as many products as you can think. You can do food, you can do cosmetics, you can do nutraceuticals, you can do medicines, you can do pigments, you can do animal feed, you can do aquaculture feed, you can do plastics. If you can think about it, algae can probably produce it for you. And when you add in the power of genetic engineering on top of that, the world is algae's oyster in terms of product production. And today, of course, we're here to focus on food. And I'm very excited to be here with a number of other algae companies. Non-Food is here, Algama is here, Spira is here. So if you haven't visited them in the exhibition area, I encourage you to do so. They're doing some very exciting things. The product that you want to produce from algae is going to dictate the type of growth system that you use. So things that require very tight control or very clean production, you're looking at closed systems, either indoor or outdoor closed systems with light or without light, or in some cases mixotrophic system where you're using light in addition to a carbon source. But when we talk about commodity products like protein or omega-3s, which we are going to talk about in a little bit, We're talking about very large-scale production, and this means outdoor open ponds. And this is what we really call algae farming. The traditional, sorry, I can't figure out the laser. The traditional type of raceways is what's shown in the middle. Those are Oswald raceway ponds. They look like a racetrack. And this is what most algae farms have on them today. And so this is where we're going to concentrate our talk about algae as agriculture and being the green machine for cellular agriculture in particular. So at Qualitas Health, this is our mission. We want to revolutionize the way that we nourish humanity by unleashing this amazing potential that algae has. And actually, this mission is pretty common to all algae companies. There's so much potential here, and there are so many different ways to harness it that a lot of people are working on this. At the reason is because algae have so much product potential in addition to biomass potential, they are an excellent, excellent resource for filling this vital need that we have as we continue to grow the population. We don't have very much land left. Traditional agriculture is not going to be able to keep up with this population growth. Our natural resources like water are not going to be able to keep up with this population growth. And algae does not have to be grown on arable land. It does not have to use fresh water. So you couple those two things with the fact that it has very high biomass potential and an amazing diversity of potential products, especially in the nutritional space. And you really, I hope, come to the conclusion that algae is going to be a big part of the answer for feeding us in the next 35 years. Qualitas in particular, I'm going to use Qualitas as an example because I have lots of pretty pictures to show you. And it's a very good example of an algae farming company. And our mantra really is algae as agriculture. We call ourselves a food and nutrition company. One of the talks earlier said companies either position themselves as a food company or a technology company. And we position ourselves as a food company because we want to talk about what you're putting in your mouth. And algae is the way that we make the thing that you put in your mouth, but that's really what we want to concentrate on, is feeding the world. So we've chosen to do open pond cultivation, and the reason is because there's lower cost inputs, it's less complex. Mostly, there's significant overlap with traditional agriculture, and so what this allows us to do is leapfrog some of the hurdles that you have to overcome when you're trying to produce a new microorganism for products. We just borrow from ag. We use agricultural fertilizers, we use agricultural principles like integrated pest management, those kinds of things. Additionally, because we're using a farm model, what we're setting up is something that can be implemented in many places around the world. So we don't have to have a single big lab or a single big factory. What we're looking at is having many of these, just like you do with traditional agricultural crops, all over the world, and centralizing processing instead. So where can you actually grow algae? For the type of growing that we're doing, which is outdoor open ponds, we're looking at areas that have at least 300 days of sunshine, plenty of brackish water, plenty of relatively flat, non-arable land that doesn't have a current use. And what that leaves us with, basically, is the southwestern United States and northwestern Mexico. And in fact, our two farms that I'm going to tell you a little bit about are in New Mexico and in Texas. Our processing facility is in Leon, Mexico, and it'll become important about processing just in a moment. So for those of you that have never been to an algae farm, this is what a typical algae farm looks like. So as I mentioned, you have the raceway ponds. They look like a track. The water is moved around by the paddle wheels, which are the structures in the end of the raceways there. And this one in particular has plastic-lined ponds, which is very common. Environmental agencies often require that you have the plastic-lined ponds for protecting underground water sources. And in this particular case, this area had been heavily used for agriculture in the early 20th century until about 1970, and the water became too salty over time, and then they had to stop farming. So this land was fallow for almost 40 years before we built this farm here. Because it was used for agriculture, you've got a 1% grade over the land. That area of New Mexico used flood irrigation for watering crops. So when we built this farm, we took advantage of that, and the water is moved around the site mostly by gravity. There are only 2 pumps on the facility, so we have a very good energy footprint, and all the water is recycled. So when we do the harvesting of the algae, we remove the algae from the water and we put the water back into the growth system. If you look at our Imperial, Texas farm, slightly different. You'll probably first notice that there are no plastic liners. This area has a very big clay component to the natural soil, and so we're able to make watertight basins or watertight ponds simply with compaction and good construction technique. But we still use paddle wheels. We still use the same cultivation methods. We're cultivating the same strain at this farm as we do it at the New Mexico farm. We're using the same harvesting technology, and this is the demonstration of the farm model that I talked about, which is it's a cookie cutter process within some specifications, and I can farm the same thing in West Texas that I can farm 8 hours away in southern New Mexico. So how does algae farming actually work? Well, it works like every other farm, right? You have a field and you plant your crop, you fertilize it, you keep the weeds out, you keep the pests down, you harvest it, you send it to your processing facility, and at that processing facility, it's turned into either a raw ingredient or a final product, and that either raw ingredient or final product then goes out into the world, and that's how we feed people, right? This is the same for peanuts, it's the same for wheat, corn, peas, cotton, you name it, this is the way farming works. And so we really have heavily borrowed from traditional agriculture for our method of algae production. So why will farming algae work? You know, there's this saying algae farming's great, but it's weird and not very many people know how to do it. Well, if you look at U.S. crop production in terms of metric ton per acre, what you can see is that we get about 1.25 tons of wheat, we get about 1 ton of peas, we get about 1.75 tons of soy. Not sure where the other two numbers went. You get about 5 tons of corn, you get 16 tons of algae per acre. And the great thing about algae is that it's an addition to and not an alternative to traditional agriculture. And that's because we don't want fresh water, we don't want arable land, right? So let's say you're already farming sorghum, soybeans, whatever it is, and you've got an area of land that's not very good soil and you can't plant it. You can plant 25 acres of algae and make a really big difference, right, in terms of your biomass productivity as a farmer. The other thing is that because we can grow in areas like the southwestern region of the United States, if you look at that, there's not a lot of population there. That's why we like it. Nobody's using the land, right? There's also not a lot of industry there. There's not a lot of jobs. That area tends to be economically disadvantaged to other more northern regions or eastern regions. And so this also gives us the opportunity to generate jobs and add value at places in the country where there's very little opportunity to do that. So the value proposition for farming algae is that we're 100% plant-based, we have full traceability and control of the process, we're sustainable, and we're scalable. And we think this is a very good model for producing algae for nutritional components all around the world. We've talked about how to algae farm and why to algae farm. Now let's talk about what you farm when you talk about farming algae. There's a lot of strains that you can choose from. At Qualitas, we've chosen a strain called Nanochloropsis as our first production strain. It's very high in EPA, which is an important omega-3. It's also very high in protein and has a complete protein profile. So when we think about what products are we going to produce from algae on our farms, we want to produce products that there's a need for. So when we think about omega-3s, some of the issues with omega-3s are the traceability. You don't know where that fish has been for the last 4 months. We think about sustainability. Marine ecosystems are very fragile. We don't want to impact that, but omega-3s are a vital nutritional component that we need to have in our diets. And then we also think about quality. So how would algae omega-3 be better just because it's algae omega-3 than fish or krill after you get past the sustainability stuff? And what we see is that algae omega-3 has higher absorption in the bloodstream than krill or fish, and we believe this is because of the polar lipids. So EPA is attached to polar lipids. Polar lipids have a hydrophobic part as well as a hydrophilic part, which allows them to be more easily absorbed than the triglyceride versions from krill or fish. So in addition to having all these wonderful things around sustainability and scalability and being plant-based, you also get to absorb more of the good stuff, right? So you get more bang for your buck out of your omega-3 dose. When we think about protein, protein is kind of protein if you have a good, complete protein profile. So where algae protein really makes its mark is on the sustainability. If we look at, again, production per acre, what we see is that algae produces way more protein, or in this case, I've differentiated that it's pounds of essential amino acids per acre than peas. So if you look at the 150 acres that Qualitas farms, and you think we're going to get 6,000 pounds of essential amino acids out of that, that makes our farms equivalent to a 45,000 acre farm of peas. That's a huge differential that we're talking about in terms of plant-based, especially protein production. And then if we go on to talk about natural resource conservation, our algae use very little fresh water. It's mostly in the processing side of things, and also because our workers need to drink water and use the restroom. And everything else we do is very salty water. And if you compare to peas, we're talking about 9,000 gallons per pound of essential amino acids versus the 5 gallons for Nanochloropsis. So the power of algae-based products is we reach new consumers every day, especially on the omega-3 side. It's vegetarian and vegan. Consumers with dietary restrictions that we can now have access to, and we especially are able to reach consumers that are looking for sustainable solutions from agricultural products. So why is it important that there are actually products out on the market? Algae has been around for about 70 years now, and it's also been this really great and wonderful idea, right? If we could only produce algae from wastewater, if we could only produce protein from algae, if we could do this, if we could do this, if we could do this. And what Qualitas is doing and what Algama and Non-Food and Spira and other people are doing by bringing products to market is we're showing now that algae is real, it's a viable alternative, and we're doing it at a scale that is going to be available to everyday consumers all over the U.S. to start with, and very soon all over the world. And so this really is a breakthrough for sustainable nutrition, and in my opinion, it's also a breakthrough for agriculture in general. And the overall goal is not just to be a single part of your day, but to be part of every meal that you have every day, right? We want to be part of your morning breakfast. We want to be part of your snacks. We want to be part of your main meal of the day. And so by farming algae in open ponds, I really think that we're going to be able to make that happen. Thank you very much.
So we have already quite a few questions from the audience. First one is, why do you think research in and commercialization of algae won't boom but then bust this time around as it did in the 1950s and 60s?
That's an excellent question. There have been 2 other booms and busts in between the 50s and 60s and now. Wow. So we have a lot to learn from. And I would say that the biggest lesson that was learned from the last bust, which was the biofuels bust, is that scale is king. If you're doing your demonstration in 1,000-liter, what we would consider micro ponds, and not going beyond that, you are not learning the lessons that you need in order to be successful at a commercial scale. And so there's been a big push in recent years to have the minimum test size be 60,000 liters or larger. And by comparison, the largest ponds that I have are 2¼ acres. Those are 2 million liter ponds, right? The smallest pond that I make production in is 600,000 liters. So even if you start the demonstration scale at 60,000 liters, you're a full order of magnitude below the smallest commercial scale production. And that's where the emphasis is going, and I think that's what's going to make the difference.
That's excellent. Other than spirulina, what's an algae food we may already be familiar with?
Chlorella is out there. I don't know if you all have chlorella in your smoothies. Astaxanthin is produced from algae. Beta-carotene is produced from algae. Carrageenan is produced from a macroalgae. It's an additive in a lot of different things as a thickener. If you gave me another minute, I could probably come up with 10 more, but those are the most common.
What's your favorite algae-based food?
Oh,
If you can pick a favorite.
I do. It's very conventional, so I apologize, but it's sushi.
It's sushi?
Yeah.
I have a question about sort of the taste factor. So I've tried the Spira product and I love it. It's delicious. It's lime flavored. I think to mask some of the flavor of algae, is that something that you think is going to be super necessary moving forward? Is sort of incorporating some of those taste ideas and features into algae-based food products?
I think so. I'm going to divide that into two parts. You have your whole algae products, which is what people normally get when they get spirulina, like whole spirulina powder or tablets, or chlorella whole cell tablets. And that requires very clean production to have a nice flavor. And typically, when you do have clean production, it smells very grassy, right? Very fresh, like you've just mown your lawn. When you don't have very clean production, you get not so great smells. And that's actually what requires the masking. When you talk about a lot of other algae-based products, and I'll point to Algama on this, their algae-based product is an ingredient in something bigger. And so just like their products, our protein, our job is to make it as colorless, odorless, and tasteless as possible, right? You just want the protein. You don't want anything else, so that it's a good base ingredient for some other food.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. I didn't even realize that somebody asked that question. That's amazing. Why aren't plant-based meat companies using algal protein rather than soy protein?
Commercial size. They need many, many, many tons of protein in a single year for what they're doing, and there aren't any super large algae protein producers out there. Our protein is not ready for the market. We are talking to various different people, not just meat replacement folks, but other folks about what to do with our protein when it is available on the market. But even if we gave all the protein that we make to alternative meat producer, it would be a small fraction of what they need in order to make their product.
Have algae farms been affected by climate change?
So yes and no. Some farms that are in places like the world's largest algae farm is in Hutt Lagoon, Australia. And they took a natural lagoon where Denaliella was growing, and they sectioned it off and took advantage of that. And a place like that, because it's a natural ecosystem, seems to be more stable. And then if you look at our farms, we certainly get hit by weather events. Qualitas in 2015 actually lost production, the whole farm, due to a hurricane and the torrential downfall. So we get flooded out just like other crops can get flooded out.
So just to follow on to that question, for people who might be interested in algae farming or algae production, what are some of the strategies sort of long-term that you're thinking about in terms of the changing climate? Like, what are some of the ways that you think you can modify your farms, or some of the technologies you're looking at that might help you weather that?
Well, I'm glad you said weather, because that's our biggest problem.
Yeah.
You can't control the weather, right? But you can analyze the outcomes of weather events and mitigate for those. And so, for example, one of the reasons that algae crops fail when you have big rain events is not the rain itself. It's because your culture becomes highly diluted. The salts in there become highly diluted, and your strain has some salinity tolerance below which it's going to crash, right, and die. And so if you think about those things in advance, you do get some warning with especially major weather events, and preparing for that by either taking a number of ponds offline, or allowing the salinity to naturally get higher, or even bumping the salinity by the addition of exogenous salt. Those are things that you can deal with and control for.
And so that idea of balancing salinity and pH, that kind of follows into the next question. Do you have contamination problems in your open ponds, and how do you tackle it? Is it through changing pH or salinity, or how might you?
So there are lots of ways that you can control for contamination in your open ponds, and this is actually one reason for one of the earlier busts in the algae boom and bust cycle. One of the things that was done in the biofuels, the recent biofuels trend, was to stop treating algae like a microbial culture in terms of outdoor open pond cultivation, and actually treat it like a field, and then take the principles of integrated pest management, which everybody uses in traditional agriculture, and tweak them ever so slightly to use them for algae. And once you take that mindset and you make those tweaks, it's actually very easy to control for contamination in outdoor ponds. And it's everything from changing pH, changing salinity, it can be changing the way that you fertilize. There are all kinds of things that we can play with when you harvest to keep that contamination to a minimum.
Excellent. And I have one more question that I'm not sure is up here, but I think given our panel yesterday, I'm also interested to hear the answer to this. How has your training as a scientist influenced your perspective as a farmer?
I'm going to flip that and say it was my experience growing up on a farm that has served me much better as a scientist trying to commercialize a new crop. You have to be very practical. And you have to be willing to say, you know, in a perfect world, it would be like this, but we're outdoors, we're in open ponds. There is no perfect world. So how can I take my scientific training and apply it to the imperfection to get something that's viable and scalable and is going to mean something?
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering our questions and for this talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you all.